So, this module we will continue our discussion on what kind of typical security policies and mechanisms are put in place with certain kinds of configurations to deploy network security in practice. So, what are the very common security threats that are typically possible from the external world on any network, right. So, first activity that is typically done by the hacker or the attacker is that they will try to do a sort of a mapping of the network to find out what are all the potential targets devices that needs to be attacked, number one. Once they find out what kind of targets are running, they will try to find out the physical characteristics of the target in terms of what is the hardware, what is the operating system or the firmware that is actually running on it, depending on whether it is a server or a network device, right. Once they identify what firmware or the OS is running on it, they will basically find out next what is the version of that particular OS or the firmware. Once they find out what is the OS or the firmware version, they will basically know by experience what kind of possible compromises are available on that particular version, and those kind of compromises they will try to attack one by one and then see whether with that list of compromised loopholes whether they could actually try to penetrate the server and bring it down, right. So, what they first basically do what is called as a case the joint where they find out what kind of services are implemented on the network. Then a typical command like ping will be made use of to determine what are the host and the kind of addresses in the network are. Then once they do this, once they find out the address, on that particular address they will try to find out what kind of ports are open. So, the way they actually try to do it is that they basically try to establish a TCP connection to each port in sequence and then see what happens, right. So, if they get for example a port reset, that means there is nothing that is running on the service on that particular port possibly, and there are also very sophisticated tools like Nmap that are available which will basically do this complete scanning activity and then give you the result in a very user interactive form also, right. So, with all these activities the external person who is trying to get some details about the target network will have enough details at hand to start doing his actual attack, right. So, what kind of countermeasures could actually be done to sort of prevent this kind of a mapping? So, record the traffic that is entering the network, and if there is any kind of a suspicious activity, be it in terms of the source IP address from which it is originating, or if there is a very frequent port scan that is actually happening on any of the IP addresses locally. So, like these, if there are any kind of a suspicious activity, then an attempt or some sort of a preventive measure should be immediately done to ensure that those specific IP addresses are actually blocked immediately from getting inside our network. The next possibility of a threat is basically packet sniffing. So, packet sniffing, as we will see subsequently in one of our later modules, is there are tools that are actually available to sniff the packets on a media and then display the contents of the packet, right. So, any kind of a packet that is actually getting broadcasted out, a person will be able to sniff it out very easily, and all he needs is only a promiscuous NIC mode which will have the capability to read all the packet that is actually passing on in that broadcast medium, right. And unfortunately, if the package is containing some kind of very highly secure data like the passwords, that too unfortunately in an unencrypted form, then all the passwords of the users will be easily get accessible by the attacker, right. So, what kind of a countermeasures that could typically be done by an organization against packet sniffing is that, so all the hosts in the organization can run a software that could periodically check if the host interface is in a promiscuous mode, because only if the NIC card is basically in a promiscuous mode, the packets could basically sniffed out, and if it could be, if the NIC card is prevented from getting into a promiscuous mode, then the risk associated with the packets getting sniffed gets completely eliminated. So, the next threat that could possibly happen is IP spoofing. So, as we were discussing in the previous module, IP spoofing is basically a mechanism by which I try to use another IP address rather than my own IP address in situations where I know that if I actually use another IP address, I will basically be able to bypass certain rules that has actually been configured, right. So maybe one particular IP address is actually allowed access through a firewall to the external network, and attacker would basically want to change his own IP address, source IP address in his packet to be that of the IP address which is in which the firewall has been configured to allow the packets to get out, right. So if that actually happens, then that will be a violation of the firewall rule, wherein even though my packets are not allowed to get out of the network, my packets will be able to get out because I have actually changed the IP address, the source IP address in my packet to be the IP address of another machine which is actually allowed in the firewall to get out, right. So this is a possible threat that could actually bypass certain firewall rules that has been set up. So for that, one of the common measures that is actually avoided, that is actually implemented, is what is called as an ingress filtering, where the routers will not basically forward the outgoing packets with an invalid source address, right. So now how the router determines that it is an invalid source address? It has its own algorithm to determine whether the source address is invalid or not. One of the checks in that validity of the source address is that is this source address present on the interface in which this packet has actually come, right. So if that is not the case, then the router will know that there has been actually a IP spoofing, because of which the router is actually sort of programmed to drop those packets, right. So for example, if I am basically getting a packet from this particular interface, and the source IP address of the packet is basically the address of B, right, and let us say that my B is somewhere here and there is no connectivity of B with this particular router at all, right. So there is no way by which I will be able to get the packet that is actually coming in here with the source address as B. Now with this kind of an ingress filtering mechanism, the router, when it receives a packet, will have this as one of the criteria to check for the validity of the source address, and will silently drop the packet in cases where it finds that the packet is being received on an interface and the source IP address of the packet is not matching with the network address of that particular interface. So this is one way by which the IP spoofing threat is actually eliminated by doing certain configurations on my router device, right. So we just had a look at what the denial of service attack is in the previous module. So it is basically a flood of maliciously generating packets just with purely with the intention of only swamping the receiver, and without any real intention of really making use of the establishing a legitimate connection with the receiver, right. So a modified version of the denial of service is what is called as a distributed DOS, where instead of a single attacking machine, there is a very well coordinated multiple sources which actually swamp a single receiver at the same time, right. So thereby the server which is getting attacked can possibly die down in a much quicker time as compared to getting attacked only from a single external server, right. So that is basically what is referred to as a distributed DOS also. So what kind of countermeasures do I really have? So the firewalls today basically have a mechanism to filter out any kind of flooded packets that are actually coming in beyond a particular threshold level, right. So all these configuration is configurable at the firewall device, where I will say that within a particular duration of time, if I basically get the same type of packets, right, I will basically block that particular IP address for a certain period of time, right. So the certain period of time is typically a random period of time, because of which that particular server that is there behind my firewall is protected from getting attacked and wasting all his memory resources or whatever it is on the attacker that is getting triggered from outside the network, right. So in addition to having this filtering out mechanism, typically I also have a way by which I could do a trace back to the source of floods, right, which is the machine that is actually triggering this attack by trying to generate this kind of heavy traffic with the sole intention of trying to bring down my server, right. So it is also a possibility that even though I sort of trace back to that source machine, that machine itself is something which is very innocent and which is not triggering this, but because of some level of loopholes that was existing there, right, that machine itself would have been compromised first, and because of that fact, that machine would have been used as a source for generating these attacks by the attacker, right. So then we come into the secure sockets layer. So any kind of a network browser to a network web server that we are trying to use right now, right. So if you for example try to access any kind of your online bank account or a e-commerce portal site or whatever it is, you will always find that you have to make use of only what is called as an HTTPS, right, and not HTTP. Now what is this HTTPS? This is basically a secure form of HTTP protocol where before your data actually goes out. So for example, let us say that you are giving your bank account details or you are giving your credit card details or whatever it is, or for obvious reasons you do not want it to be getting transmitted in a plain text form, but you want it to be actually getting transmitted only in an encrypted form. Now who is going to do this encryption? It is basically the secure sockets layer that is actually available for the TCP to be making use of for having all the data that is actually getting sent out by the browser to the server and back, right, back the response back to the server to the browser, all of them getting encrypted and then getting sent out, right. So what kind of services that are possible through this secure sockets layer? So secure sockets layer is actually a huge topic by itself, but the kind of very common security services that are typically used is, one is the server authentication. So where the server is really authenticated to ensure that it is actually the server with whom this particular browser wants to really get in touch with, number one. Number two, doing a data encryption and the data decryption part of it, and then number three, an optional client authentication, right. So there are certain situations in which the server alone is not authenticated, but the server would also want to know whether the client is really the client which is actually claiming itself to be, right. So the SSL mechanism also has inbuilt techniques in place which will be able to do the client authentication part of it also if required, right. So how is the server authentication done? So SSL enabled browser includes the public keys for the trusted certificate authorities. The CAs means certificate authority, which are who are the people who are actually authorized to basically give what is the digital certificates to the individual entities. So the browser will basically request the server certificate initially, and it will allow only if that particular server certificate has been signed and issued by a trusted certificate authority, right. So if that is not the case, the browser will basically typically give a warning to the user saying that it seems to be an invalid certificate and whether the user would really like to continue taking a risk, and only if the user says that yes, they would like to continue, the session will continue to have proceed further for the actual data transfer, and the user says that they do not want to take a risk, the session will be getting terminated then and there, right. So then the browser will basically use the public key of the certificate authority to extract the server's public key from the certificate. So the digital certificate that we actually saw in the previous module is one mechanism by which I will be able to distribute the public key of the server to the client browser, right. So with this, the browser will be able to get the public key of the server, which has to be used for encrypting the data before sending out from the browser to the server, right. So once this encrypted data with the public key is sent out by the browser, it reaches the server will use the private key that it knows internally, so that is its own private key, decrypt the data and then get back the original data, right. So that is basically how typically the secure sockets layer is helping me to do the encryption part of it as well as authentication part of it by having the server authentication done by the digital certificate which contains the public key of that server, right. So there will be an encrypted SSL session, as I was telling you, encrypted with the public key that has been actually communicated to the browser through the digital certificate, and the server will be using the private key to decrypt the data and then getting back the original content, right. So in addition to the SSL, at the network layer you also have something called as an IPsec. So IPsec basically a IP security mechanism that is actually implemented at the network layer in my 5-layer stack, right. So I also have a way by which I could have the data completely encrypted inside my IP datagram, and I will also be able to do the network layer authentication where the destination host can authenticate the source IP address of a particular packet. So, the packet is actually mentioning that this is a source IP address of the packet. So, that could actually be authenticated by the destination host, thereby really verifying that it has actually come only from that particular IP address, right. So, there is something called as an authentication header protocol and encapsulation security payload protocol, which helps me to basically have all the network security services that I will typically require, right from authentication to providing me confidentiality to providing me the message data integrity part of it, all available as part of these two protocols, right. So, how this actually works is there is something called a security association that is actually created between the two ends for both authentication header protocol as well as encapsulation security protocol, and the security association that is created between the source and the destination helps me with providing with all these kind of security services, right. So, the IPsec is basically a security mechanism. It is a very comprehensive security mechanism that is actually available to me as part of the network layer, and that provides me all the services that I typically require from a typical network security protocol. Thank you.